The moment Effie Hurst stepped off the westbound train at Dusk Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, she made herself a solemn promise. She would not cry, she would not look back, and she would not answer a single question about where she had come from. The platform was raw timber over hard-packed earth, and the wind off the plains hit her square in the face like something deliberately unkind. She stood there with one leather traveling case and a hat that had seen better days, and she breathed in the smell of coal smoke and horse dung and dry grass, and she thought, good. This is nothing like home. This is exactly what I needed. Dusk Creek was not much to look at. It sat at the edge of the Kansas plain like something that had fallen off a wagon and decided to stay. There was a main street of maybe 8 or 9 buildings, a general store, a saloon called the Copper Nail, a livery, a small church with a crooked steeple, a barber shop that doubled as the dentist's office, and a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Clara Potts, who was broad in the shoulder and narrow in the patience. There was a sheriff's office at the far end, and beyond that, the land just opened up and rolled away toward the horizon like a slow, green promise. Effie walked the length of that street with her case in one hand and her chin level. People watched. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, and had the kind of stillness about her that made people nervous. Not because she was frightening, but because she looked like a woman who had already made up her mind about something important and wasn't going to discuss it. She rented a room at Mrs. Potts's boarding house for 50 cents a week, which was almost everything she had. She set her case on the narrow cot, sat beside it, and looked out the single window at the flat Kansas sky and let herself breathe for the first time in what felt like years. She had left Ohio 3 weeks ago. She had told no one where she was going. She had left behind a life that had been slowly suffocating her for the better part of 4 years, a marriage that had turned gray and then cold, and then something she couldn't name but could only survive. And she had buried her husband, Robert Hurst, in the churchyard outside Millfield, Ohio, on a Tuesday in February when the ground was frozen, and the minister had said dutiful things that meant nothing. And she had stood at the graveside in her black dress and felt mostly numb and mostly relieved and deeply ashamed of the relief. She had not told anyone she was relieved. She had worn her grief correctly, quietly, for exactly 3 weeks after the funeral, and then one morning she had packed that leather case and walked out of the house on Garfield Street and not looked back. She was not running from anything illegal. She had not done anything wrong. She was simply running from the person she had been while she lived that life, and she needed enough distance between herself and Ohio that she could figure out who she was supposed to be now. Kansas seemed far enough. She found work within 2 days of arriving in Dusk Creek. The general store, Alderman's Mercantile, needed a hand behind the counter because Mr. Alderman's wife had taken ill in the winter and hadn't fully recovered, and Mr. Alderman himself was a round, harried man who could barely manage the inventory ledger and the customers at the same time. Effie presented herself, demonstrated that she could read, write, count change accurately, and was not afraid of hard work, and Mr. Alderman hired her on the spot for $3 a week. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She settled into a routine with the determination of someone building a wall brick by brick. She was at the store by 7 in the morning. She swept the floor and organized the shelves and served the customers and tallied the accounts in the afternoon. She ate supper at Mrs. Potts's long table with the other 3 boarders, an elderly surveyor named Mr. Granger, a young woman named Delia who worked at the Copper Nail and pretended not to, and a taciturn German man named Heinrich who nobody knew much about but who always said please and thank you and never caused any trouble. She went to bed early. She read by candlelight. She did not go to the saloon. She did not encourage conversation about her past. When people asked where she had come from, she said Ohio, and when they asked what she had done there, she said she had kept a household, and when they pushed any further she gave them a polite, flat smile that closed the door without slamming it. She had been in Dusk Creek for exactly 11 days when she met Luke Watkins. He came into Alderman's Mercantile on a Thursday morning in April, ducking his head slightly under the doorframe because he was tall 6 feet and an inch. She would learn later. And he had the kind of face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something honest and angular. He was 31 years old, though she didn't know that yet. He wore a dark hat with a brim that had been pushed back, a canvas shirt that had been washed many times, and boots that were clean despite the fact that he had clearly ridden in from somewhere with red dirt on the road. He had brown eyes that looked at things steadily, and there was a quality about him that Effie noticed immediately and could not quite name, a quality of stillness that matched her own, though his came from a different place. He set a list on the counter and said, "Good morning. You must be the new hand Mr. Alderman hired." "I must be," Effie said. She picked up the list and read it without looking at him. "This is a lot of cornmeal." "I've got hands to feed," he said. "Ranch, about 8 miles west, the Double Creek spread." She started pulling items. He did not hover or make small talk the way some of the men did, which she appreciated. He watched her work with a quiet attention, and when she had everything assembled and tallied, he paid without argument and thanked her by name. "Thank you, Miss Hurst," which surprised her because she hadn't introduced herself. "Mr. Alderman mentioned you," he said, reading her expression. He said he'd finally found someone who could manage the accounts without adding an extra column of arithmetic that didn't belong there. "That's a generous recommendation," she said. "He's a generous man," Luke said, and there was a warmth in the way he said it that told her he actually meant it. Then he tipped his hat and carried his supplies out, and she watched through the window as he loaded them into a buckboard wagon with easy, practiced movements. And then he drove west down the main street and disappeared into the heat shimmer. She did not think about him that evening. Or rather, she told herself she didn't think about him, and then found herself halfway through a paragraph in her book, before realizing she had been reading the same sentence for 4 minutes without registering a single word. He came back the following Thursday. Same list, nearly. Different order of items, which suggested he had rewritten it from memory rather than copied the previous one. She noticed things like that. She had always noticed things. In her previous life, noticing things had mostly brought her pain, so she had trained herself to notice less, but out here in Kansas the habit was returning and it felt less like a liability. "How are you settling in?" he asked while she assembled his order. "Well enough," she said. "Dust Creek takes some getting used to." "I imagine it does. You came from Ohio, Mrs. Potts tells me." Effie set down the bag of coffee she was weighing and looked at him directly. "Mrs. Potts talks quite a bit." Luke Watkins did something unexpected then. He smiled, not a smug smile, not a testing smile, but a genuinely amused one that changed the whole shape of his face. "She does," he agreed. "I apologize for repeating it. I shouldn't have said that." She picked up the coffee bag again. "You don't have to apologize. Ohio is true." "I won't ask anything else," he said simply, and she believed him, and she didn't know what to do with the feeling that settled in her chest when he said it. He came back the next Thursday and the one after that. Always on Thursdays, always with a list. Always polite and unhurried and considerate in a way that was not performed. Not the studied courtesy of a man trying to impress someone, but the natural courtesy of a man who simply was that way. He asked her opinion on coffee brands once and genuinely weighed what she said. He told her once, when she commented on the quality of the flour she'd been stocking, that the grain out of the mill at Callaway Creek was better and she should tell Mr. Alderman to switch suppliers, and he said it the way someone offers useful information, not the way a man offers advice to a woman he thinks needs his guidance. In May, there was a fire. It started in the livery and nobody was sure how, though the leading theory in town was that young Billy Marsh had been smoking where he shouldn't have been. The livery burned fast and hard, and the wind pushed embers east along the main street, and by the time the bucket lines were organized, the barber shop was catching. Effie was at the Mercantile when the alarm went up, and she did what she had always done in a crisis. She moved quickly and efficiently and did not stop to panic. She organized the women and older men into a secondary bucket line from the trough behind Mrs. Potts's boarding house. She kept people from running into the smoke-filled street. She helped old Mr. Granger, who had gone out in his nightshirt in a confused state, back to safety on the boarding house porch. By the time the fire was out, she was smudged with ash and her hair had come half down from its pins, and she was sitting on the boarding house steps with a cup of water, very tired, when Luke Watkins appeared beside her. He was in the same state, ash-dark and exhausted, and he sat down on the steps without asking permission and said nothing for a long while. Then he said, "You organized that secondary line." "Someone had to," Effie said. "Most people were panicking. Panicking doesn't put out fires." He nodded slowly, and she could feel him looking at her in the way he had, steady and unhurried. "Where did you learn to do that?" She opened her mouth and then closed it. The old habit, the old reflex to pull back from anything that led toward a real answer about her life. She felt it like a physical thing, like a hand closing around her throat. But then she said, surprising herself, "I managed a household for a long time. When things went wrong, I was the one who had to keep moving." It was more than she had said about herself to anyone in Dust Creek. Luke did not press. He did not ask what kind of things had gone wrong or what household or what happened to it. He just nodded as though she had said something entirely reasonable and said, "Well, Dust Creek is lucky you came west." And he stood up and touched the brim of his hat and went back to help the men clearing the burnt timber from the street. She thought about him that evening. She admitted it to herself. She sat at the window and watched the stars come out over the flat Kansas plain, and she thought about the way he talked, direct but never hard, interested but never prying. And she thought about the fact that in 6 weeks of weekly visits to the mercantile, he had not once asked her anything she didn't want to answer. Most people in Effie's experience either pried because they were nosy or they didn't ask because they didn't care. Luke Watkins seemed to occupy a third position. He was genuinely interested in her but seemed to understand with some quiet instinct that there were rooms in her that weren't open yet, and he was willing to wait outside them without complaining. She found that profoundly disorienting. In June, there was a town social at the church. Mrs. Potts insisted all the boarders attend, and Effie, who had been managing to keep to herself with some success, found herself in a clean dress in the little church hall eating cake and being introduced to the same people she had already been serving at the mercantile. There was a fiddle player named Old Pete who played with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and there were lanterns strung up along the eaves, and the evening had that golden-edged quality that summer evenings in Kansas sometimes achieved. Luke Watkins was there with 2 of his ranch hands, a young man named Cooper who had a wide gap-toothed smile, and a quiet older man named Santos, who tipped his hat to Effie with great formality when they were introduced. Luke himself had changed his shirt for the occasion dark blue instead of canvas, and he had combed his hair, and when he saw Effie across the room, he simply nodded in acknowledgement the way he always did, without the slightly overwarm greeting that some of the men in town adopted at social occasions. She found herself grateful for that. She drifted through the evening carefully, talking to Mrs. Alderman, who was feeling better and had strong opinions about the federal government's land policies, and to Delia from the boarding house, who was being courted by a cattle broker named Simmons and was deeply conflicted about it, and to the minister's wife, who asked Effie 3 times if she had considered joining the ladies' choir. It was warm in the hall and she stepped outside onto the church steps to breathe, and Luke Watkins came out 2 minutes later. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to Old Pete manage something that was approximately a waltz. "He means well," Luke said. "He truly does," Effie agreed. Another silence. Comfortable rather than awkward, which was something. "Do you dance?" Luke asked. "I used to," she said. "Used to. Things fall away," she said, and she wasn't only talking about dancing, and they both knew it. He looked out at the darkening plain and said, "I stopped going to these things for a few years after my wife passed. Figured I'd gone enough and could stop." He paused. "Cooper shamed me into coming back. said a man who stays home every Saturday turns into a man who talks to his horses. She turned to look at him. She had not known he was a widower. Nobody had mentioned it. How long ago? 5 years, he said. Fever. It was fast, at least. He said it with the measured calm of someone who has carried a grief long enough to know its weight exactly. I don't say that looking for sympathy. I only mention it because you seem like a person who appreciates plain speaking. I do, she said quietly. I figured, he said. He looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that was careful and hopeful at the same time, the way a man looks when he is about to say something he has thought about more than once. I also figure you've got your own weight you're carrying, and that's your business entirely. He looked back at the plane. But for what it's worth, the carrying gets lighter out here. At least it did for me. Something about all that open sky. She looked out at the open sky in question. It was vast and dark and thick with stars in a way that Ohio sky never quite managed, the Milky Way visible as a smear of silver from one horizon to the other. Maybe, she said. No pressure to agree with me, he said, and she heard the small humor in it. She almost smiled. I'll consider it. He nodded, satisfied with that, and they stood there in the warm June dark for another few minutes before going back inside. And Effie thought that she had not felt this unalone in a very long time. The summer deepened. She began to look forward to Thursdays with a directness she refused to examine too closely. She noticed she made sure to have his usual items already separated and ready before he arrived, which was a habit she extended to no other customer. She noticed she was quicker to smile in his presence than in anyone else's. She noticed that when he came in with a problem, a question about accounting for ranch supplies, or a request for a specific item he wasn't sure she could source, or sometimes just a thing he had seen on the ride and that seemed worth mentioning, a hawk nest in the cottonwood east of town, a weather front building in the north, she felt a quality of attention in herself that she recognized as interest. Real interest, not politeness. She also noticed that it frightened her. She had been interested once before. She had been young and hopeful and interested, and then she had been married, and then she had spent 4 years learning that interest was not enough and hope was not enough, and that two people could make each other profoundly unhappy, even without any particular malice involved. Robert Hurst had not been a cruel man. He had been disappointed in his life, and he had leaned that disappointment against Effie until she buckled under it. And by the end, she had been so reduced by it that she barely recognized herself. The relief at his graveside had been the relief of something that had been pressing on her chest for years finally being lifted, and the shame of that relief was something she carried like a stone in her pocket. She had promised herself, on that westbound train, that she would not do that again, that she would not fold herself into the shape of another person's expectations, that she would not mistake a man's attention for love and rush toward it because she was lonely. She held that promise up like a shield on the Thursdays when Luke Watkins came into the mercantile and talked to her with his quiet, direct honesty, and the shield held mostly, except for the particular Thursday in July when he came in not on business, but to ask if she would like to ride out to see the sunset from the ridge west of town. "The ridge," she said. "There's a view from up there that I think you'd find worth seeing. The light does something in the evenings that I can't quite describe. I've been trying for 5 years and haven't managed it." He paused. "Cooper thinks I should stop trying and just show people. He's usually right about things like that." She stood behind the counter and looked at him. He was looking back at her with those steady brown eyes, and she could see that this meant something to him, that he had thought about this, had decided to ask, had considered how she might answer, but there was nothing demanding in it. Nothing that said she owed him a yes. Nothing that said anything at all except that he thought she might like it and he would enjoy her company. "On Sunday," she said. "Sunday works," he said. "I'll bring a horse for you if you ride. If you don't, the buckboard does the job fine." "I ride," she said. "Then Sunday," he said, and he picked up his supplies and paid and left, and Effie stood behind the counter for a moment with her hands flat on the wood and breathed very deliberately. He came to Mrs. Potts's boarding house on Sunday at 4 in the afternoon with 2 horses, a solid roan for himself and a gray mare who was, as he said, steady as a table and pleasant to ride. Effie came down in her regular dress, having spent approximately 45 minutes telling herself that this was not a thing worth fussing over, which meant she had fussed slightly and then been annoyed at herself for it. Mrs. Potts watched from the parlor window with an expression of deep satisfaction that Effie chose to ignore. They rode west out of town in the long golden light of a Kansas July afternoon, and he was right that the light did something out here that she couldn't name. It turned the grass a color that was between gold and green and didn't have a word, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that happened only in the last hour before sunset, deep and saturated and completely serious. They rode without talking much, and it was not uncomfortable. She had not ridden in 2 years, and it came back quickly, the posture and the balance and the rhythm, and the gray mare was indeed as pleasant as advertised. The ridge was not much of a ridge by the standards of anyone who had seen mountains, but it rose enough above the plain to give a view that went for miles in every direction north and south. The grass rolled away in long curves, and west the sky was beginning to go orange along the edge. They stopped the horses and watched it. The sun went down slowly, pulling colors after it: orange, then coral, then something deep and rose-violet that stayed for a long time. The light on the grass was extraordinary. He had been right that he couldn't describe it. She couldn't either. "I've been to this ridge probably 200 times, Luke said after a while, "and it's different every time. Some nights it's modest about it, some nights it does that." He gestured at the sky, which was currently doing something spectacular. "Why did you want to show me?" she asked. He thought about that for a moment. "Because you seem like a person who's been looking at the ground for a long time," he said. "And I thought maybe you were ready to look up." She felt that land somewhere in the middle of her chest. She looked at the sunset rather than at him because she needed the moment. Then she said carefully, "I was married before. He died in February, that's why I came west." She said it the way you say something you have been holding under pressure quickly before you can stop yourself. Luke said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry for your loss." He said it without interrogation, without the follow-up questions that people in Ohio had wanted. Was it sudden? What happened? Were you very much in love? And she appreciated the simplicity of it. "I'm not sure how sorry I am," she said, which was the most honest thing she had said to another person in 6 months. He looked at her then, and his expression was not shocked or judgmental. It was just open. "That's allowed," he said. "Is it?" "Grief is complicated," he said. "Anyone who tells you it isn't is lying or hasn't done enough of it." She pressed her lips together and looked at the last of the sunset, which was going purple now along the horizon. "It wasn't a good marriage," she said. "I don't mean he was a bad man. I just mean it wasn't a good marriage. And I wore that for a long time, and it wore me down, and when he died I felt something I'm ashamed of." "Relief," Luke said. Not a question. She looked at him sharply. He met her eyes with steadiness, no condescension, no pity. "Yes," she said. "I know something about that," he said quietly. "Not about my wife, Sarah was a good marriage, but I know about carrying something that wears you down. I know what it feels like to set a weight down and not know if you're allowed to feel lighter for it." He looked back at the horizon. "I think you're allowed. I think you came a long way to give yourself permission, and I think you ought to take it." She had not cried since February. She had not allowed herself to. But sitting on that gray mare on a ridge in Kansas with the last of the sunset turning the sky to violet, she felt the back of her throat tighten in a way that surprised her, and she blinked 3 or 4 times and breathed through it, and it passed. "You don't have to tell me what you're leaving behind," Luke said then, and the way he said it, simple, absolute, with no condition attached, broke something in her and mended something in her at exactly the same time. "I mean that, whatever it is back there, you don't owe me an explanation, and you never will." She looked at him for a long moment in the failing light. "I know," she said, and she did know it, which was the remarkable thing. She had known it for weeks, had felt it in the particular quality of his patience, but hearing him say it plainly, Those words in that order, said like a promise, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. They rode back in the dark, mostly in silence, the horses finding the way without much help. The stars had come out in full force and the plain was silver and black around them, and there were coyotes somewhere far off singing their strange high song, and it was not a frightening dark but a vast, accommodating one that held everything in it without judgment. At Mrs. Potts's gate he helped her down from the mare, which was more courtesy than necessity, but she accepted it, and his hand was warm and steady, and he released her as soon as she had her footing. "Thank you," she said. "You were right about the view." "I usually am about sunsets," he said, and there was the quiet humor again. "Good night, Effie." She had been Miss Hurst every time before. She noticed the shift. She did not address it. She went inside and stood in the hall and listened to his horse moving away down the road, and she thought about what it meant to set a weight down and whether she was finally ready to. She was. August came in hot and relentless, and Dusk Creek baked and complained and went on with its business. Effie had become a fixture in the mercantile in a way that Mr. Alderman described proudly to anyone who would listen. Mrs. Alderman recovered fully and came back to help on busy days, and she and Effie worked together with easy efficiency and occasional humor. Effie had also, without quite planning to, become something of a resource in town for women who had arithmetic problems or letters that needed writing, and there was a quiet satisfaction in being useful in that way. She and Luke had settled into something that was slightly more than what it had been before the ridge and the sunset, and the things they had said to each other up there. He still came on Thursdays, but sometimes he came on other days too, to ask her opinion on something, or once to bring her a book he had been carrying back and forth from a lending library in the next town over, and had thought she might want. The book was a collection of natural history observations by a woman botanist, which was an unexpectedly specific choice. "How did you know I'd want this?" she asked. "You ask Mr. Alderman questions about the local plants," he said. "Every time he gets in a new kind of seed, you want to know where it grows and what conditions it needs." She had not realized anyone had noticed that. "I used to grow things," she said. "In Ohio. The garden was mine. It was the one thing I made entirely for myself. There's good growing ground at the Double Creek," he said. "The south side of the house catches light well. I've never done much with it." She looked at the book in her hands. "Are you suggesting something?" "Not suggesting," he said. "Just observing." She smiled at that, and he saw it, and the expression on his face in response was something she tucked away and looked at later in private, like a thing she didn't quite have a name for yet. In September, Cooper Luke's ranch hand with the gap-toothed smile came into the mercantile on a Tuesday while Luke was in town on other business, and leaned on the counter with the air of a man who had appointed himself to do something. "You know, he's been in better spirits these past few months than I've seen him in years," Cooper said. "I don't know what that has to do with me," Effie said, weighing dried beans with focused attention. "Sure you don't," Cooper said cheerfully. "He fixed the fence along the south pasture last week. He hadn't touched that fence in 3 years. Interesting timing. Fences need fixing regardless of timing. He also," Cooper said, "combed his horse before coming to town today, and his horse doesn't care." Effie set down the beans. "Cooper." "Ma'am, go away." He laughed and went away, and Effie went back to the beans, and the color that had risen in her face took a while to recede. When Luke came in that afternoon, she was behaving normally, she thought. She handed him the list of items she had put back for him, and she was entirely her regular composed self. And then she made the mistake of looking up at exactly the moment he was looking at her, and they both looked away at the same time, and the silence was approximately 2 seconds of pure admission of everything that had been accumulating between them for months. He cleared his throat. She straightened a jar of preserved plums that did not need straightening. "Effie," he said. "Luke," she said. Another small silence. "I'd like to court you properly," he said, "if that's something you'd be willing to consider." She had known this was coming. She had known it for at least 6 weeks, which was why she had been having conversations with herself about it in the small hours of the night, going back and forth across the question until she knew it from every angle. The fear was still there. It was honest in her, and she didn't pretend otherwise. The fear of making herself small for someone again. The fear of folding herself up and disappearing the way she had before. The fear of needing someone and that need being used against her. But Luke Watkins had shown her, in 7 months of quiet consistency, that he was not Robert Hurst. He was not disappointed in his life. He did not lean his weight against other people. He was a man who fixed fences and brought books and meant what he said and did not ask for more than what was offered. And she was not the woman she had been in Ohio. She had come a long way to stop being that woman. "I'd be willing to consider it," she said. He exhaled, and there was something so purely relieved in it that she almost laughed. "Good," he said. "Good, I wasn't certain." "You weren't. You're not easy to read," he said. "I mean that as a compliment. You're careful." "I have reasons to be careful." "I know," he said, "and I'm not asking you to stop being careful. I'm just asking you to maybe be careful in my direction for a while." She did laugh at that, a real laugh, and it surprised her. It had been so long since laughing had felt natural rather than performed. He looked enormously pleased by it, and she made a note to herself that making Luke Watkins enormously pleased with a laugh was a very good feeling. For a while, she agreed. The courtship was conducted with a seriousness and a humor that Effie found suited her exactly. He took her riding most Sundays after services, not always to the ridge, but across the range around the Double Creek spread, and she came to know the land the way you come to know something you will belong to, eventually learning its textures and its patterns, where the creek ran low in fall, and where the wildflowers came through the grass in unexpected colors, and where the wind had shaped the cottonwoods into asymmetrical, beautiful forms. She met his hands properly, Santos, who was originally from New Mexico Territory and had ridden for the Double Creek for 11 years, and Cooper, who had been born in Missouri and was 23, and had the enthusiasm of a man who had not yet been ground down by anything. There was also a third hand, a quiet young man named Thomas who had only been with the ranch since spring, who shook Effie's hand with both of his as though sealing a very important agreement. She saw the Double Creek spread for the first time on a Thursday in October, when she was not working, and the autumn light was doing something extraordinary with the cottonwoods along the creek bank, turning them gold so intense it looked heated from inside. Luke walked her around the place with a proprietorial pride that he kept just barely in check. She could see that he loved it, that it was not merely a livelihood for him, but something he had made real through years of hard work, and she liked the fact that he loved it this way. The house was solid and square and needed a woman's attention in ways it hadn't had since Sarah, which was apparent without being sad. It was simply a house that had been lived in by men for 5 years and had specific gaps in it as a result. She did not say any of this. She noticed it the way she noticed things, quietly, storing it. The south side of the house caught light exactly as he had said. The ground there was good, rich dark soil under the dry surface grass, and she could see it clearly, what it could be. Roses, maybe, or kitchen herbs, or the kind of sprawling vegetable garden she had kept in Ohio in the years before the garden stopped feeling like hers. "You're looking at that south corner like you've got plans," Luke said. "I was just thinking," she said. "What you were thinking looked very specific." She smiled. "Peonies," she said, "and rosemary and kitchen garden on the far side where the angle is right, maybe some sweet peas along the fence." He looked at the corner for a moment, then at her. "I like that," he said. "That sounds like somebody who's planning to stay." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He nodded slowly, and the expression on his face was one that she had come to recognize, the one that looked like careful hope, which was the best kind. "Good," he said. "Because I'd very much like you to stay." It was October when he kissed her for the first time, and it happened on the front porch of the Double Creek house at the end of an evening when she had come out for supper with him and Santos and Cooper and Thomas, and Mrs. Potts had known she was going, and had given Effie a look that conveyed about 14 separate things without using words. Supper had been good. Santos cooked, and Santos was a serious cook who produced something from dried beans and smoked pork and chilies that was better than anything Effie had eaten since coming west. And afterward they had sat on the porch, while the evening cooled and Cooper had told stories about a cattle drive he'd been on before coming to the double creek that got progressively more implausible as the night went on. And Luke had looked at Effie once or twice with a shared private amusement that felt intimate and easy. Cooper and Santos and Thomas had gone off to the bunkhouse, and Luke had walked Effie out to the gray mare, which Mr. Alderman had lent her for these occasions with the benevolent indulgence of a man who had clearly been briefed by his wife. The night was cold and clear, and the stars were doing their usual extravagant Kansas display, and Effie had just gotten her foot in the stirrup when Luke put his hand on her arm gently, and she turned. He was looking at her with that careful, serious expression, not the humor and not the quiet warmth, but the version underneath both of those, the version that was just him saying something true. "May I?" he said. She understood him. "Yes," she said. He kissed her quietly and without urgency, the way a man kisses someone he has thought about for a long time and wants to remember, and she put her free hand against his chest and felt his heart beating steadily under her palm, and she kissed him back with the same seriousness, and the night was cold, and the stars were enormous, and she felt something happen inside her chest that was the opposite of closing down, something that opened. When they separated, she looked at him for a moment in the starlight. "I'm not afraid of this," she said. She said it partly to herself and partly to him because she had expected to be and wasn't. "Good," he said. "Neither am I." November, December. The winter came down hard on the plains, and the world went gray and white and wind-scoured. And Effie had moved, by now, from Mrs. Potts's boarding house to a small room above the mercantile that Mr. Alderman had been using for storage, because the boarding house had taken in a family of 4 who needed the space, and because the room above the store was better positioned for the account work that had expanded to fill real need in Dust Creek. She cleaned it up and made it livable and put her books on a shelf and her few things where they belonged. And it was small, but it was entirely hers, and that mattered. Luke came to town often now, not always on Thursdays, and sometimes he came only to see her, and they sat in the front room of the mercantile after it closed, drinking coffee and talking, and Effie had discovered that talking to Luke Watkins was one of the great pleasures of her current life. He was thoughtful and observant, and had a dry, intelligent humor and genuine curiosity about things, and he asked her questions, not the probing questions about her past, but questions about her opinions and her observations, what she thought about the state land policies, whether she believed in the germ theory that the Eastern papers were reporting on, what she made of the new minister's wife who had replaced the old one. She told him things in pieces over those months. Not everything, not all at once, but pieces. The way the marriage had shrunk her slowly, the way she had stopped trusting her own judgment because Robert's disappointment had taught her that her judgment was wrong, the way she had lost herself so gradually that she hadn't realized how far gone she was until she stood at the graveside and felt the weight lift. He listened to all of it the same way, present and steady, and not attempting to fix it or reframe it or tell her how to feel. Just listening. It was an extraordinary quality in a person, and she told him so once, and he said he thought it was mostly a matter of patience, and she said she thought it was more than that, and he said maybe they were arguing about the same thing. She loved him by December. She knew it with the clarity of something that had been true for a while before she named it. It was not the breathless, urgent love of young women in novels, which she had experienced once at 20, and which had turned out to be mostly infatuation. It was quieter than that and more certain. It was the kind of love that is built out of small things, his voice saying her name, the way he looked at the sunset with something like reverence, the way he had said, "You don't have to tell me what you're leaving behind," the way Santos had told her once in passing that Luke had not been the same man since she came to Dust Creek, and had said it with such simple, matter-of-fact happiness that it had undone her. She did not tell Luke this immediately. She had learned to take things at a pace that belonged to her, not the pace that circumstances seemed to demand, and she wanted to say it when it felt exactly right. The right moment presented itself in January, in a snowstorm. She had ridden out to the Double Creek on a Saturday, the weather having been clear in the morning, but the afternoon brought a bank of cloud up from the north that moved fast, and by 3 o'clock it was snowing in earnest. Luke told her she should stay. There was no question of riding back to town in that, and she stayed, sleeping in the house in the room that had been a guest room and was kept clean and prepared, because Luke Watkins was a man who kept things ready for the people he cared about. The storm blew through the night, and the next morning the world was white and still and extraordinary, and she stood at the kitchen window drinking coffee while Luke built up the stove, and everything was very simple in the way that things become simple sometimes when the ordinary world is covered up. "Luke," she said. He looked up from the stove. "I love you," she said. "I'm not in a hurry about anything, and I'm not telling you to change the pace of things. I just wanted you to know in case you didn't." He stood up from the stove and looked at her for a moment, and the expression on his face was one she had never quite seen before on him, not careful hope, but something that had moved past hoping into arriving. "I love you too," he said. "I have been trying to say that for about 3 months without making it pressure." "I know," she said. "I felt it. I just needed to say mine first." He crossed the kitchen and put his hands on either side of her face with the care of someone handling something precious, and he looked at her for a long moment before he kissed her, and she reached up and put her hands over his and stood in the snowed-in kitchen in the January stillness, and thought that this was what it was supposed to feel like. This steady, mutual, unafraid thing. He proposed in February, which was a year since she had buried Robert Hurst in the frozen Ohio ground, and she was aware of the symmetry and was not troubled by it. She was aware that one February had ended something and another February was beginning something, and she thought that was fitting, that the calendar year had turned over and the world had turned over with it. He asked her at the ridge at sunset, which was the right place. He did not make a performance of it. He simply said, standing beside her in the cold February air with the sun going down in its winter colors, paler than summer, quieter, "I'd like to marry you, Effie. If that's something you want." She considered it for exactly the time it deserved, which was a moment, and then she said, "Yes, that's something I want." He produced from his coat pocket a ring that had been his mother's, a small garnet in a plain gold setting, and put it on her hand, and she looked at it in the winter light and thought about how different this felt from the first time, how certain and chosen and free. "I want us to be equal in it," she said. "I want my name on things. I want my opinion to count." "Always," he said, without a second's hesitation. "And I want a kitchen garden," she said. He laughed, a full real laugh that went out into the cold air. "You can have the whole south side," he said. "You can have the front porch if you want. You can have whatever you need." "Just the south side," she said, "for now." They were married in April, which was a year and 1 month after Effie Hurst had stepped off the westbound train at Dusk Creek with one leather case, and a hat that had seen better days, and a promise to herself not to cry and not to look back. The ceremony was at the little church with the crooked steeple, and Mrs. Potts cried even though she said she wouldn't, and Mr. Alderman gave Effie away with enormous solemnity, and Mrs. Alderman threw flowers with vigor, and Cooper made a speech at the celebration afterward that was equal parts heartfelt and absurd, and got a standing ovation from Santos. The minister said the words, and Luke said his with a steady voice and clear eyes, and Effie said hers with a steadiness of her own that was not distance but resolution. The resolution of someone who knows exactly what they are choosing and has chosen it with all of themselves. When they rode out to the Double Creek that evening, the spring light was on the cottonwoods along the creek, and the grass was greening from the roots up, and Effie stood on the south side of the house and looked at her ground and felt it, the belonging, the unqualified forward-looking good feeling of it. She planted her garden in May. Rosemary first along the fence, because rosemary is hardy and forgiving and smells extraordinary in the sun. Then peonies along the south wall, because peonies are patient and return every year and get more extravagant with time. Then a proper kitchen garden, laid out in neat rows, with tomatoes and beans and sweet peas threading up the fence posts, and herbs thyme and sage and basil that she kept inside on the windowsill until the night stopped threatening frost. Luke watched her work with an attention that was not interference but something more like appreciation, and sometimes he helped, and he was a good helper. She gave him a task, and he did it without modification, which she found deeply satisfying. Santos said once, coming around the corner of the house and finding Effie knee-deep in the garden with dirt on her hands and arms, that the place looked more like a home than it had in years. He said it quietly, not unkindly, and she said thank you, and he nodded and went on, and she felt the simplicity of being known and welcomed settle around her like something warm. Summer at the Double Creek was full and physical. There was ranch work that Luke managed with the 3 hands and occasionally her help when an extra pair of steady hands was needed, and there was the garden, and there was the keeping of the house, which she did on her own terms and with her own system, and there were evenings on the porch that were long and golden and quiet, and there was the ridge, which they went back to regularly, and the library in the next town over and letters. She began writing to her sister in Ohio, cautiously at first, and then more openly, because distance had given her the ability to be honest about the life she had left without bitterness. Her sister Ruth wrote back. The letters were careful and then less careful. Ruth had known, she said, had known the marriage was wrong, had been afraid to say so, had felt guilty since February. Effie wrote back and said there was nothing to feel guilty about and she meant it, and she felt the old weight ease a little further with each letter. She was happy. Not the fragile, performed happiness of someone making the best of something, but the real kind, the kind that includes difficult moments and hard days and is not undone by them. The kind that has room for the full weight of a person's actual life and holds it without complaint. In the fall, she found she was expecting a child. She told Luke on an evening in October, sitting on the porch with the harvest done and the cottonwoods going gold again along the creek, and she said it directly because she had learned that direct was better. Luke, we're going to have a baby. He was quiet for a moment. She could see the processing happening, the careful man taking in the large thing and giving it its proper space. And then the expression on his face shifted into something so purely, straightforwardly happy that it made her throat tight. He reached over and took her hand. "Are you well?" "I'm very well," she said. "And how do you feel about it?" "I'm happy," she said. "I'm genuinely, completely happy. I want to be sure you know that I'm not just saying so." "I know," he said, and he did know. He was always good at knowing the difference with her. He held her hand and they sat in the October evening, and the cottonwoods were gold and the air smelled of wood smoke from the house, and the coyotes were starting up somewhere far out on the plain, and she thought that this was so far from everything she had fled that it was almost unimaginable, and she had done it. She had come west to bury her past, and she had done exactly that. Had laid it in the Kansas ground and let the grass grow over it. And out of that ground, improbably, something extraordinary was growing instead. The winter was quiet and long, and she was round and warm in it, which was not uncomfortable but was certainly significant. Luke fussed in ways he tried to conceal, which she found endearing. He made sure the woodpile was never less than 3 cords. He rode to town more often than necessary to check in with the doctor, who was a somewhat distracted man named Ferris who nevertheless knew his work. Cooper, for his part, treated Effie's condition as a matter of great personal importance, and spent the winter reading a veterinary manual he had borrowed from somewhere, and making optimistic comparisons that she chose not to think too hard about. Santos, practical and kind, taught her 3 things about managing cold weather in a house on the open plain that turned out to be genuinely useful, and probably saved the water pipes from freezing twice. The baby arrived on a Wednesday morning in late March, which was almost exactly a year to the day since Effie and Luke had been married, and he was a boy. They named him James, after Luke's father, and he was red-faced and emphatic and entirely healthy. And Effie held him in the bedroom of the Double Creek house with the spring light coming through the window, and felt a love that was unlike anything else she had ever felt, not replacing or diminishing the love for Luke but parallel to it. A different element of the same life, equally real. Luke sat beside the bed and held her hand and looked at his son with an expression that was still the same careful, hope-becoming arrival that she had come to love on his face, and she watched him hold James for the first time with the steadiness of a man who is very much committed to not dropping the most important thing he has ever held. "Hello, James," he said, very quietly. "We've been looking forward to meeting you." The baby regarded his father with the profound skepticism of the newborn. "He has your eyes," Luke told Effie. "He has your nose," she said. "Poor kid," Luke said. "I like your nose," Effie said. James settled the argument by falling asleep. Spring grew up around the Double Creek while Effie recovered, and James grew from alarming to merely demanding, and the garden came back with the intensity of something that had been well planted and was now committed. The rosemary spread along the fence. The peonies opened in May in a pink so extravagant it looked like a deliberate act. The kitchen garden produced abundantly, and she put up preserves and dried herbs and sent jars of them to Mrs. Alderman and Mrs. Potts and her sister Ruth in Ohio, who wrote back that the rosemary salt was the finest thing she had ever received through the post. Cooper, who had taken a shine to the baby with the unrestrained joy of someone who has no responsibilities regarding the baby, carried James around the ranch occasionally under strict supervision and narrated the livestock to him with great seriousness. James appeared to find this acceptable. Santos said once that the Double Creek felt like a family now, in the full sense of the word, and he said it not as a compliment but as a fact, and Effie believed him. The second year of their marriage was full in ways that exhausted and satisfied her in equal measure. James was walking by November, which meant he was everywhere. The kitchen garden expanded. She began keeping proper accounts for Mr. Alderman part-time from the ranch, riding into town twice a week, which she liked because it kept her connected to Dust Creek and to the people in it, and to the person she had built there when she had been only herself. Thomas, the quiet young hand, turned out to have a hidden talent for carpentry, and he built James a proper cradle that converted to a small bed, and he built 2 more chairs for the porch, and Effie commissioned a garden bench for the peonies that he executed with more elegance than the job technically required. One afternoon, riding back from town on the gray mare that Mr. Alderman had eventually sold her outright for a fair price, she passed the place on the main street where she had stood on the day she arrived. The platform was a little more weathered now, the town itself somewhat busier with a new supply store and a proper doctor's office. And she thought about that woman who had stepped off the train with her leather case and her flat, closed expression and her promise not to look back. She had looked back. She had looked back quite a bit, actually, in letters to Ruth and in conversations on the porch with Luke, and in her own private accounting of things. But she had looked back the way you look back at a road you have traveled in order to understand how far you've come, not the way you look back because you want to return. There was a difference, and she had learned it. She had come west to bury her past. She had buried it. And from the ground where she had buried it, she had grown something, a life that was fully hers, a marriage that was equal and honest, a son who ate porridge with the conviction of a small emperor, a garden that returned every spring more extravagant than the year before. In the evening she came home to the Double Creek, and the light was doing its long golden thing across the grass, and Luke was on the porch with James on his knee pointing out something on the horizon with the focused attention of a man teaching a very small person something important. She dismounted and tied the mare and came up the porch steps and stood beside them. "What are you teaching him?" she said. "Cloud types," Luke said. "That one's a cumulus. He seems interested." James grabbed Luke's finger with both hands and examined it with great focus. "He seems interested in your finger," she said. "Adjacent subject," Luke said. She sat down beside him and he shifted James to his other knee so he could put his arm around her. And they sat in the evening with the light going gold and the boy and the vast sky and the sound of the creek somewhere below in the cottonwoods. And there was nothing unresolved, nothing left hanging, nothing she was carrying that she hadn't chosen to carry. "Cooper told me today that he's thinking of heading to Colorado," she said. "He told me too," Luke said. "He's been restless. Are you all right about it?" "I'll miss him," he said. "But it's the right move for him. He's 24. He needs to see more than one part of the world before he settles." He paused. "Santos knows a man looking for work. Good writer, apparently." "Santos always knows someone. It's his finest quality," Luke agreed. They were quiet for a while. James had fallen asleep against his father's arm with the sudden and complete efficiency that babies deploy, and Luke held him with one arm and kept his other arm around Effie, and the evening light was going rose-pink now along the western horizon. "I want to plant an apple tree," she said. "On the east side where the ground stays damp near the creek. I think it would take." "An apple tree takes years to fruit properly," he said. "I know," she said. He turned to look at her, and she knew he understood what she meant, that she was planting for years from now, that she was planting because she was here and she was staying, and the future was a place she was making rather than avoiding. "Plant the apple tree," he said. She planted it in the spring, when James was a year old and wobbling energetically through the garden with a proprietary attitude toward the peonies. It was a small thing, the apple tree, a bare root whip from a nursery catalog, arriving in brown paper looking like nothing much. She planted it with care, got the depth right, watered it in, staked it against the wind. It would take 3 or 4 years to establish and longer to fruit properly. She did not mind. She was very good at patience now. She had learned it in pieces, out here in the open country in a life that was turning out to be real. The spring she planted the apple tree, she also learned she was expecting again. She told Luke at the ridge at sunset, because the ridge was their place, and the sunset was the thing that had first told her she was ready to look up. He laughed out loud when she told him, a surprised, delighted, completely unguarded laugh, and she laughed with him. And James, who they had brought along because he was at the age where he refused to be left anywhere, looked at both of them with great seriousness and then decided it was acceptable and went back to examining a grasshopper. "2," Luke said. "2," she confirmed. "We'll need to expand the house. I know, I've been thinking about it." "You've already designed it in your head." "Most of it," she admitted. He shook his head with the fond exasperation that she had learned was his particular expression for the moments when she was most fully herself. "What would I do without you?" he said, and it was not quite a question. "Considerably less," she said. He kissed her temple and she leaned into his side, and the sun went down over the Kansas plain in the colors that still had no proper names, and the grass rolled away in every direction like an answer to every question she had ever brought west with her. The second child was a girl, born in November, healthy and loud and possessed of extremely strong opinions from the first day. They named her Sarah, for Luke's first wife, which felt right to Effie, not a shadow but an honoring, a way of saying that all the people who had mattered were still here in some form, that the past was not only loss. James regarded his sister with the careful consideration of a boy who had been the only child and was reassessing the arrangement. He eventually determined that she was acceptable, particularly when she began grabbing his fingers the way he had once grabbed Luke's, and he took this as the formation of an alliance. The house expansion Thomas built over that winter, 2 rooms added off the east side, properly insulated against the Kansas cold, with windows that caught the morning light. Effie designed them, Thomas executed them, and Luke and Santos did the heavier labor, and by spring the Double Creek house was the kind of place that could hold a family comfortably and still have room to breathe. Cooper wrote from Colorado in the summer, a long, rambling letter that said he had found work on a cattle operation outside of Denver, and had met a woman he was going to marry if she'd have him, and the mountains were something else entirely, but he missed the plains. Luke wrote back and said the planes were here when he needed them and to bring the woman to visit. They came the following spring. Cooper and his wife, whose name was Ada, and who was a practical, warm-hearted woman from Missouri who took one look at Effie's garden and said, "You planted those peonies from divisions, didn't you?" Which was exactly the right question, and they were friends by the end of the day. Ruth came from Ohio that summer. Effie had been corresponding with her for 2 years by then and had long since made her peace with the past, and when Ruth stepped off the train at Dusk Creek, older and more tired than she remembered but herself, recognizably herself, Effie held her for a long time in the middle of the train platform and felt the last small piece of what she had been carrying set itself down. Ruth spent 3 weeks at the Double Creek. She and Luke got on well from the first day, which did not surprise Effie. Luke had the quality of making people feel that they were being fairly assessed and found good. And Ruth, who had spent years worrying that Effie was lost to them, needed exactly that reassurance. She played with James and held Sarah and sat in the garden every morning with her coffee and said once quietly that she had not known Effie could be this happy and that she was glad to have been wrong. "I didn't know either," Effie said honestly. "The West suits you," Ruth said. "It does," Effie said. "Or maybe I just finally suited myself and this is where I happen to do it." Ruth considered this. "Both," she said with the authority of an older sister. The apple tree bloomed for the first time that spring, small white flowers, delicate and determined, visible from the kitchen window on the morning she woke up and happened to look. She stood at the window and looked at it for a long time. Luke came and stood beside her and saw what she was looking at. "There it is," he said. "There it is," she said. It was not a grand moment in the way of weddings and births and declarations on windy ridges. It was quiet and domestic and entirely real, which was better than grand. It was the tree she had planted for the future coming into its own evidence, small, white, cert, pointing forward. She had come west to bury her past. She had done it. And in the ground where she had buried it, in the open country under the enormous Kansas sky, she had planted things that grew. The Double Creek settled into its life around all of them with the unhurried permanence of a place that has decided it is exactly what it is supposed to be. Santos stayed on for years, until he retired to a cousin's place outside Santa Fe with a horse and a handshake, and a supper that went until well past midnight. Thomas stayed even longer, building things for half the county eventually, marrying a woman from Callaway Creek, who had opinions about garden design that led to long and productive conversations with Effie over the fence. James grew up on that land, knowing every inch of it, where the creek ran clear and cold even in summer, where the red-tailed hawks nested in the cottonwoods, where the grass grew tallest in the low ground after rain. He was steady and quiet like his father and precise and determined like his mother, and the combination made him someone who was very difficult to argue with and very easy to trust. Sarah grew up with strong opinions and a garden of her own that she began making from the age of 4, by the simple expedient of transplanting things from Effie's beds into arrangements that made sense only to Sarah. And Effie, watching this, felt something that was pride and recognition in equal measure. They had a third child too, eventually another boy, born in the spring when James was 6 and Sarah was 4, whom they named Thomas after the carpenter who had built the rooms and the bench and the cradle, and who arrived into the world with the equable temperament of someone who had looked at his existing family and decided they were manageable. The ridge at Sunset remained theirs. They went back to it across the years, sometimes alone together, sometimes with the children piled into the buckboard, sometimes with company from town. The light was always different. It was always worth seeing. She never did find the words for what it did, and neither did he, and eventually they stopped trying and accepted that some things were beyond language and were not diminished by it. On an evening in the fall, years from the day she had arrived, Effie stood on the porch of the Double Creek house and looked at what her life had become, the garden at the end of its season, the apple tree dropping its fruit into the grass, the sound of the children inside, The smell of supper from the kitchen, Luke coming around the side of the house from checking on the horses, his hat pushed back on his head the way it always was, his face the face she knew better than her own now. He saw her on the porch and came up the steps and stood beside her the way he had stood beside her 100 times, looking out at the same thing she was looking at. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening," she said. They stood in the fall quiet, the sun going down in the west in its uncatalogued colors, the grass rolling away in every direction, the big sky doing its particular work of making everything feel both very small and very significant. She had come west with a leather case and a flat expression and a promise to herself. She had kept the promise in the way that promises work when you keep them right, not by holding everything out but by letting the right things in, by choosing deliberately, by being patient with herself and with the world, and with the man beside her who had looked at her broken and guarded and had simply said, "You don't have to tell me," and had meant it, and had proved it over and over in the way that the small, ordinary daily evidence of a life together proves the large things. "What are you thinking about?" Luke said. She looked at the horizon. The light was doing something exceptional tonight, layers of gold and rose, and the particular deep blue of a fall evening, each color holding its place clearly. "I'm thinking that I'm glad the train stopped here," she said. He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was the one she loved best, not careful hope, but something beyond it, something settled and sure and warm, the expression of a man who knows exactly what he has and does not take a single day of it for granted. "So am I," he said. He took her hand. They stood on the porch of the house they had made together, in the life she had built from the ground up out of her own choosing, and the evening came down around them like something gentle, like something that had been waiting all along for her to arrive and rest in it. And the stars came out one by one over the Kansas plain, enormous and clear and entirely unreasonable in their beauty, and she looked up at them the way a woman looks up who has finally remembered how.